Hello, 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 and welcome after that amazing screening of our Dance of Revolution. Remember that if you purchase tickets, you can watch it anytime over a 72-hour period between now and the end of the festival, October 25th. Um, I am so honored to be in the company of some amazing folks, some of whom we've saw in the film. I am co-hosting with Kin Folkz from California. Barrett Macaulay is here from Seattle and will be working with us. Phillip Pike, the wonderful director. David Pert, you have to give me your last. It's a double name.
Lewis-Peart.
Lewis-Peart. And Rodney, I can just barely make out your name, honey.
Diverlus.
Diverlus. Thank you so much. Who are both in the film, and whose faces I'm sure you all recognize. I am Cooper Seeley, and I'm the lead QT BIPOC programmer for the Seattle Queer Film Festival. Again, we thank the Canadian Consulate of Seattle for supporting this incredible work, our ability to showcase work by people of color originating in Canada, like Philip. Canada has come such a long way. I'm also Canadian born, and it's absolutely wondrous to know that the Canadian Consulate in Seattle is supporting this work. That's pretty great. Thanks as ever to Kathleen, who is our director. She made this all happen and brought us all together, and the committee, the QT BIPOC committee, who were absolutely insistent on showing this film and having this conversation take place. David, because Philip, your film is astounding, amazing. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves, perhaps say what role you played in the film if you were in the film, and what role you're engaged in now. Just a brief sentence so we all have an orientation to what you're doing now and what you did in the film. And Kin and Barrett, since you weren't in the film, you can certainly introduce yourselves in whatever way you choose from your organizations. Please go ahead. Let's start with Philip.
Hey, everyone. Hello. And I want to say a big thank you, first of all, to the Seattle Queer Film Festival for inviting the film to be part of this wonderful festival. And we're thrilled that audiences, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but across the USA, have the opportunity again to see the film. And thank you to Coop and all the other folks and Kin who facilitated making this conversation possible. It's great. Looking forward to it. So yeah, I'm the director and producer of the film, and still kind of doing, film stuff. We'll see where that goes. But yeah, so that's me.
Excellent. Thank you, Philip. Let's move to Mr. Diverlus.
Likewise, so much gratitude for the Seattle Queer Film Festival for having me, and for you, Cooper, for moderating this. I was thankful to be featured in the film as one of the many queer voices with Black Lives Matter Toronto, and I'm an art maker and a community builder.
Thank you. And David Lewis-Peart.
My name is David. I, in the film, was speaking to some of the work that I had once been a part of, alongside some other folks at Sunset Service Toronto. Now I teach and I write. That's some of the work that I'm engaged in.
Thank you. And Barrett Mccauley.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for gathering us here in space together in light. I am Barrett Mccauley. I'm based here in Seattle. I am a founder of Black Cinema Collective, where we privilege, celebrate, highlight, examine, and screen Black filmmakers from the continent of Africa, but also throughout the diaspora, the Caribbean, Latin America, and beyond, to expand conversations about who we are and what our stories are, and to unflatten the monolithic view of who Black people are in all our multiplicities.
Yes. And last but never ever least, Kin, my co-host, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, certainly. I am so happy to be here. That's what I am. I am here. We had fun. We had so much fun in our last conversation out of the Oakland, Pride Creative Arts and Film Fest. And Phillip, you created a piece that allowed us to have conversations that we've been dying to have for a while. And so I'm excited about jumping into it today. I am based here in Oakland, the land of the Ohlone, sitting on Huichin territory. My ancestry is both African and indigenous, and I give thanks for my shared heritage. I give thanks for all of the many people in the hands that made this possible so that we could have this conversation today. And you can find me at thequeerartscenter.com here in Oakland, California, where we believe that art is activism. Mm-hmm. So you want to start? Let's get into the tasty parts.
Let's take a comp. Would you like to start us off?
I would. Thank you for that. That is very sweet of you, Cooper. I'm going to start with Phillip. So Phillip, you described it as the film things, or the film stuff, or the film things, So how did this happen for you, that you became this filmmaker with this divine mission to unearth stories that many have been aware of, but most were not and needed to be educated about?
Yes, thanks, Kin. So I started my professional career as a lawyer, and after about 7 or 8 years, I came to a fork in the road and was thinking about, I wasn't, my heart wasn't really in the practice of law anymore. And so, I just came to this crossroads thinking about what's next. I was thinking about grad school. And at about the same time, I linked up with a young man who I had met at the Black Nations, Queer Nations Conference in New York in 1995. And he was in Arizona at the time. And so went out there, spent some time with him. And at the same time, he was facilitating a ceremony in the desert called Awakening the Ancestral Heart. And so if you can see, we're out in the Arizona desert, close to about 50 miles from Tucson, huge bales of hay in a big circle, sitting out there, drumming, chanting. And the idea, as I said, was to awaken the ancestral heart. And the next morning, I was in the shower, and it was like just clear as day to me that, making film is what I needed to be doing. That was where my heart was leading and pointing to. And interestingly, when I stopped and looked back, I realized that I'd always had a camera in my hand. When I was about 13 years old, my parents had gifted me a Bell & Howell Super 8 movie camera and a screen and a projector. And on family trips and stuff, I was always the one with the camera. The guy with the camera is always pestering everybody, right? So that was me.
Yes.
So that was the beginning of the journey. At that point in my life, I'd already had about 10 years of post-secondary education, so I didn't feel like going to film school for another 3 or 4 years. I just wanted to go and do it. So I took some workshops here in Toronto and in San Francisco. I got a camera, some sound equipment, and a plane ticket, and I went to Jamaica. And I mean, looking back, I probably should have done a little bit more preparation. But anyway, there you have it. Interestingly enough, the day I landed in Kingston, Jamaica, it was the 10th of December, 1998. I remember it. The following morning, I was sitting on the porch of my cousin's home and picked up the newspaper. And in the front page of the newspaper, was an article about the fact that J-Flag had just launched itself the day before, so the day that I arrived. Totally unbeknownst to me. So clearly, for me, the ancestors were at work. There was a synchronicity in me arriving the same day that J-Flag launched itself, because J-Flag, as well as Jamaica Aid Support, was very instrumental in me sort of connecting to people and getting to talk to people about the film that I eventually made, which is called Songs of Freedom, about gay life in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, from then on, it was, about sort of preparing and building a way back to where I was. Yeah.
Oh, so this is the shower epiphany that we all hope that we could have, that would lead us through this great path back to our ancestor work. And I didn't know from the last conversation that we had that you had this grounding, that your parents saw something in you as a documentarian, as someone who cared to ask questions of the people around you. So yes, you were meant to come back around to this. And I know that the skills that you garnered through your education, you still were bringing into the context of this dialogue, because you were able to tease out histories that perhaps other people wouldn't have been able to, which I find truly fascinating about the film. You have enough content here, Phillip, for 2 or 3 more versions of
Absolutely. Yeah.
So beautiful, phenomenal work.
Thank you.
Now, Coop, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, we have a series of questions, as you all know, but I just want to let the audience know as well that although Kin and I are going to be guiding this conversation, it's very much a conversation. And so you can feel free to send in your comments, and we have people working in the background who will pick up your questions and comments. The comments might roll across every once in a while, don't be surprised. And nearing the end of our conversation, in the last 15, maybe 10, 15 minutes, we're going to reserve some time to be able to pick up some of those questions. So our wonderful background tech person, thank you so much, Mocha. They will be attending to that work. But let's start with the first question to all of you. And David, I'm going to start with you this time, but you can all feel free to answer. Here's the question as I wrote it down. The work we do as activists, activators, participants in liberation is so challenging. As much as we celebrate our efforts, it can be very heavy, potentially traumatizing work. Often we forget our bodies, or we feel the need to deliberately sacrifice in order to get that one more thing done. Are we simply forgetting ourselves? Is it simple as that? Is that what's happening? So my 2-part question is, who or what holds you in your work as you work? What strategies do you use to preempt or salve trauma? And David, I'm beginning with you because in the film, as you mentioned, you were part of a faith-oriented community. So maybe you can start by letting us know how you came to that work and move out from there.
Yeah, the work of Sunset Service was a vision that Shedza and I had for a community of people of color, of queer people, of people who are sort of on the margins, to come together and to sort of honor the fullness of ourselves. What we ended up co-creating, really, we created for ourselves, if we're honest. We were part of a lot of communities at the time that met our needs in certain ways, but never, at least we felt at the time, never really held the fullness of who we were. Some spaces were predominantly queer, but didn't really carve out space for our racial identities. Some places were unapologetically Black, but didn't hold space for our queerness. Both spaces sometimes didn't hold space for those of us who were navigating faith identities, and then even within our faith communities or communities of spirituality, there was an absence of recognition of what I call like the Saturday night self, right? Like there's sometimes this sort of elevated kind of spaces that are created, and the reality is that many of our Sunday nights were, first preempted by our very full and busy Saturday nights. And so we wanted, as young people, a space that could hold all of that for us. And so we created Sunset Service out of that vision. And I feel like a lot of my life has been about trying to like answer the questions that I have for myself, and answer that in community, and answer that with other people. Like, are you feeling this way too? I'm wondering, like, and can we build it, and can we create what we need?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've observed that in my life, oftentimes by women and elder women of color, elder queer women, who were carving out spaces for me and continue to. And even now, like a lot of who I go to in community are elder women, who do amazing work holding space. Yeah, I know that maybe that didn't answer the full.
Oh no, that's a great. That's your answer.
Long rambles, but I don't actually think I answered it. Okay.
How do you find yourself in these moments when you are engaged in revolutionary work? Do you find yourself, doing that thing that I was describing, where it's almost punishing, where you're moving so hard towards something that you forget yourself?
I think that anybody who's involved in any change work, whatever you label that, and I know we've had off-camera conversations about the different ways that we, I'm resistant to certain language because I think it connotes certain things for me, and so. But if you're involved in any kind of change making work, I think that there's a currency in all of those communities, that privileges exhaustion and highlight burnout as some sort of badge of success and honor. Often talk about moving away from hierarchicalized systems, but human beings, we naturally do that. We naturally create ladders, and within a lot of change making communities, I think that the currency that we operate from is one of like, how committed are you, and your commitment is shown by the amount of like gashes and scars and like late nights and like how many breakdowns, like I feel like there's a way that we've monetized our
trauma.
Absolutely.
And in fact have centered it in such a way that it actually anchors us to that, like, I mean, like that's like the only thing, that the organizing principle oftentimes ends up becoming like how in pain we are, or how messed up we are. And so I'm actively attempting in the recent years to try to resist that. I've had a lot of like hit the floor moments where I've realized like, actually this does not serve me. And the examples of success in our communities don't have anything that I want. Ain't any happier, ain't any more whole. And so now it's like slow, simple, select, small, that those are okay too. And not everything has to be an event. Not everything has to be a performance,
Yes. I see snapping. I see praying hands. So what do you all think? How are you all responding to this question? You've had time to sort of mull it and think it. How do you feel about it? How do you feel about what David actually has said as well?
There are so many things that David said that sort of started changing the thought and answer. I'm now feeling like I'm responding to David's words, and
yes, please.
Deeply resonant the way you spoke about this performance of and commodification of our trauma, and how easily we reproduce those models, right? That makes it hard to keep our promises to ourselves and those that are closest to us in the work, to not burn ourselves out while staying on task, for want of a better word. Just thinking about this last week, being, really present to right now, there's so many people that I've engaged with, and also just looking at how I've lived the past week. I've been fascinated by how caught we are in the moment leading up to the coming elections and the, various modes of change work that we're doing, how we're almost in this panic drive to turn up the volume, and how easy it's been to slip away from self-care modalities just in the last week, and in terms of what do you do, or who holds you, or who holds it all together. I'm thinking about something you said, David, in the last time you all gathered. I had a chance to watch the record of that. Thank you, Kin, for sending that on. It was a really powerful statement. Thinking about what activism actually is. And you were saying something like activism is actually relationships, and it's community, and it's how you nurture those relationships. It actually gives birth to the activism. And so that's one of the things that I think that resonated as well when I think about where do I return to care, is by leaning closely into, or opening my heart again for others to lean closely into, just saying, slow down. That deadline's not going anywhere. And if it passes, that's okay. The work isn't going anywhere. You'll pick up again tomorrow after you get rest, because you can't let the work kill you. The work will kill you and still did it tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's it. The work will kill you and still be there tomorrow, for those who do not speak Jamaican.
Exactly.
Right? It's I had to pull my answer together based on what I just heard you speak about in your earlier talk around this film. So that's my work.
Yeah, youth and wisdom are not always a separate thing. Thank you, David.
No.
Rodney, how do you respond? How are you thinking about all of this?
Yeah, my head's going all over the place, to be honest with you. I mean, likewise, I'm hearing what David is saying, I'm hearing what Berette is saying, and I'm resonating deeply with it. I feel like when you initially asked the question around how does this work sort of land on you, I thought back to the first time I saw the film, actually, and I don't know if I've told you this, Phillip, but the very first time I sat in the premiere, sitting there in the theater, and the first thing I thought was, girl, you are tired. And because at the time, 2017, I remember vividly the day we shot it, and it was in the middle of a massive Abdirman Abdi mobilization. Like, it was that weekend that was, I slept really late, jumped right in, came in, did the interview, and then had to go. I remember I had to run. And I watched it now 3 years later, and I was like, damn, you were tired. So I feel like my answer now, now sort of 2020, the reflections are grounded in a little bit more experience. I think that I'm seeing a lot of the ways that the exhaustion and the burnout is even being duplicated in this new wave, this successive wave of younger sort of organizers and activists. I think that one thing that's perhaps missing, and I think that we as folks who have been doing the work for a little while should think through as well, is how do we actually support folks in navigating the beginning of their activism? I think back to sort of 5 years ago, no one was talking to me about care. Everyone was saying, keep going. Everyone was saying, yes, oh, for sure, let's go. There's a way that I think we also put expectation towards organizers. I think there are ways that we there's a burden in a particular way. And so I'm really interested a lot of right now, how to navigate, how does that where is there shared responsibility? And that I recognize even now I'm in a different space in my life. When I started BLM2, I was 24, and I had the capacity as a 24-year-old with no child and no partner, and just finished school and barely any full-time job. I had the capacity to work 14 hours in this work. And we see that it is no surprise that model is what sort of allows only folks in their early and mid 20s to do the work. It's part of the model. And so we can't expect just those folks to change the model because the model has been repetitious for so long. I'm curious right now as someone who's in a different, and I've noticed, I'm at a different stage of my life, sort of engaging in a moment that's more passionate than ever. This weird 2020 was not 2017, was not 2016. It is, the stakes are so much higher. And yet I'm at a different place than I was 6 years ago in my capacity to do it. And it sort of had me rethink about what does it mean, where is that shared responsibility, and that the responsibility amongst many ways for me has mentorship, strategic support, like the roles that we can play as folks who have experienced perhaps the burnout, as folks who are saying these things from experience. I think that if we don't take it upon ourselves in many ways to share those experiences, we'll just watch successive waves of folks come and experience the same thing, burn out, leave, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's not just about care. It's not just about self-care. I think that the same thing can be said about collective community care. I think the same thing can be said about conflict. I think the same thing can be said about navigating tensions within community. That was a very much a theme within the documentary in many ways, like a sort of, the mess of community, and that we wait for our folks to learn by failing. And what role do we play as folks who have experienced that failure to support folks in preemptively not reaching there? I mean, that's 2020 me talking to 2016 me, 2017 me. I think that there was a way that we joined the hamster wheel, and that you don't know you're in the hamster wheel if you're experiencing it for the first time. So for those of us who have experienced the hamster wheel many times, where does our responsibilities as people who perhaps are not in the front line, how can we share that responsibility and support those of us who are expending themselves and their bodies and their energies? Again, this is a question I've asked myself even this summer, right? There was this summer, those who had the capacity to be out on the streets, both in the States and in the Canada, were of a particular demographic, were folks who had to transition out of COVID, who were left without work and without jobs, who had a particular freedom of time and space that many of us didn't have. And so the privilege for many of us to have held our jobs means that we have to, and what role do we do then of supporting those folks who we know will experience burnout inevitably?
Kin, I think you were about to say something, but we couldn't hear you, honey. Kin, your mic is off.
It's unfolding. Collective support. Thank you for the collective support. This notion of strategic support, right? It has to be more than a notion, that we have to take the time to honor what that looks like and set up these structures to be able to support the strategic supporters. So one of the things that we've been doing over the past year, as we've come together as a collective here in Oakland to try to figure out how can we eliminate the hamster wheel? How can we eliminate that? We realized that our allies and our accomplices were central to that kind of work. We were all feeling a little burnout, and our resources were being demolished. And we are fortunate that there were a group of people who realized that it was their time to start to step in a variety of ways. And so even yesterday, there was someone who was working on an artistic piece for a festival here and needed some support and had a grocery list of all of these things to be done. And it was our role as the community of QT BIPOC people to say, rest is holy. Rest is our divine birthright. So what we're going to do is put out the call, and we're going to put it out to our allies and our accomplices, and we'll let them fulfill those roles. You get sleep, my dear, And sometimes that's a frightening, vulnerable space to put ourselves in, because our first thought was, can we trust our allies? Can we trust our accomplices to do this thing, this mighty work that we, have been doing for so long without being able to trust that. So it's definitely been a process, and it's been a process of vulnerability and acceptance of this human condition, and also a re-embrace of ourselves as spirits. So thank you so much. I didn't get Philip's response. I would love to hear your response to what holds you, my darling. You went through this process fresh, not completely fresh because you had done it before, but as you started to unearth these truths and you started to look at the way that community related to each other, that there were individuals who spent their time giving until their very last breath. You know, what has this meant to you, this question?
Well, I mean, I was one of those people, right? As David and Rodney were talking, I was thinking back to the 90s when I was sort of much more involved in activism at sort of a street level, if I can call it that. And I remember one summer in particular, one period of time, I was the chair of the board of the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention. I was the coordinator of AYA, a Black group for Black gay men. And I was the interim executive director of the African Canadian Legal Clinic, all at the same time. And the clinic had just gone through a period of massive upheaval, massive trauma. I mean, I was in meetings at midnight where Black people were shoving newspapers into each other's faces and yelling and screaming, right? And that was it was very intense. What holds you? It's community. I mean, you know, my partner, we could talk about these things. The people in community who were, you know, level-headed and sane and reasonable human beings, you know, you get on the phone and you talk to them about what's happening, and you work and you calm down and you work it through, right? So that's who holds you. And so it was really partially because of that experience why I asked the question during the interview for the film, you know, what are the challenges of community building? Because it's messy. It can be messy, and it is messy, right? It's just the nature of the thing. And so, yeah, it was really important to me. You know, I didn't want to paint, you know, see it through rose-colored glasses, or, you know, sort of paper over the reality of, this is a film about community building. Well, let's look at that side of it too, right? So yeah, that's some of the thoughts I had listening to it.
It's a real truth-telling. It's a real truth-telling, and it's one of the things I really do appreciate about the film is that complication that you offer up at different points, and sometimes unexpected moments, right? Where it's amazing to hear, to start with the house, and then move through. From generation to the next, but also offering up the taste of the complication that you just you just said was actually taking place.
Yeah.
Because
and you know that ties back into something that David said, and which Berette echoed about, you know, activism being a form of relationship building, right? Because I've been asked on some of these Q&As, you know, well, how do you do it? Where do you start? And my answer is, it always is about bonding, right? You know, you have to come together first as a group. You have to bond. You have to find that which binds you together, and then you build from there and go out. So it really is the starting point. You know, you can't. It's just, you can't go off and spin off and do stuff without that connection. It just, to me, it won't work. It won't be strong. You know.
Ashe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I deeply believe in rites of passage. I believe in birthrights. And I'm so clear that it is our divine right, every single one of us, to experience the bliss of wellness, you know? And a lot of that is, it has to start internally, that I have to be clear on a few things myself. So as I was community building, I also learned, thank goodness, from some elders that it was okay for me to step away. that was actually a very important part of building community, was for me to be able to be in my head around what I was experiencing in community.
Mm.
And then I was able to rejoin, talk to elders, talk to my same peer level friends, and just ask, are you having this same experience? Because this just doesn't feel, it doesn't feel like wellness. It doesn't feel like this is what I came here for.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, being held, and having all of my ancestor guides like James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and then on and then on and then on, you know, Hatshepsut. That's what holds. What about you, Cooper? You threw out the question before we move on to the next. I really would love to know, Coop.
I know it's so much has been rattling in my head as I mean it's why this sort of question sort of came up, and I wanted to hold on to it from our last conversation.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking through my early years in what then was a women's studies degree, right? And because I started this as soon as I started university, undergrad, I immediately started Activism. And it was a group of young Black individuals. And what I discovered is that it was the first time, because this was some time ago, it was the first time that any of us had sat in community with each other in that unique way. And what we understood suddenly was that we all realized together something was deeply wrong, right? And particularly in Canadian space, and this is like in the early 90s as well, that something is deeply wrong. We all live in Ottawa. You know, some people have come from outside Ottawa to go to University of Ottawa, and some people were there. I grew up there. But we all realized that these sets of institutions had been lying to us, and something needed to be done. And we just started. We weren't, you know when you know that you don't know.
Right.
We didn't know. We just needed to go. And there was nobody to say to us, here's how you might proceed. You know, careful with your steps. Be strategic in what you pick up and what you don't pick up. Because there was one point when I had 5 jobs and only 2 of them fed me. The other 3 were all activist jobs. And the 2 that fed me were restaurant jobs and a cookie shop.
Oh, God.
Oh, my goodness. We all relate.
It was like, oh, dinner's going to be cookies tonight. because that's how I was making it through. And again, I had the energy. But here I am as a much, a little bit later in life. And what I realized is I have developed some disabilities as a result of that, like physical disabilities, as a result of burning myself out. And there was one professor from that women's studies degree who stopped and said, and the one Black professor I had, by the way, Rosina Mart, I'll never forget her. And she stopped me. She stopped me and said, while I was in the midst of running a festival and doing all kinds of other crazy, she stopped and said, you must be strategic. If you are not strategic in what you choose to engage, then everything will devour you and they win. And she just put it really simply, because you're right. I mean, I was hearing you all talk, because you're right. Like the fight's going to be there. You need to pick up your strand and stay with that strand, and you can't do everything.
Right.
There's no way. You're not physically capable of doing it. Apparently, there's a good question that might be popping up. We have this is Kristen Hagashi. Hi, Kristen. I hope I'm not misquoting the phrase, rage is passionate love, possibly David.
Love. Right?
Really, yes. Can you see that better than I can?
Yes.
Can you read that?
I can, dear. I believe that this is something that David stated. Did you say that rage is a passionate love?
I think it's actually
okay,
Rodney.
Rodney said it. Okay, it really stuck out to Kristen, who said that rage is typically a very draining emotion, while love is described more often as healing. Does anyone feel connected to this statement? And are you able to expand on what it means to you? Rage is a passioned love.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
Well, Kristen,
Right.
thank you.
I mean, I would agree with your assessment, Kristen, that rage is draining. It's actually, it's not, it's, I think of them more like fuel sources. Like it's a fuel source. It can for sure, you know, if you're breathing fire against the state, against the man, against them, against whatever, it is incredibly draining. And it's actually not, it's impactful right away, but it's not really a long-term sustainable energy source. I think that it, for me, there are other energy sources that are perhaps more difficult to access, but are possible as well. When we talk about, you know, for me, I think of it elementally, right? Like fire is really a powerful source, but once you run out of fire, you run out of it. But in what ways can we flow other sort of energies for ourselves and for our communities? In what way, once rage is done, all of it to me is love, right? Rage can be love, care can be love, stopping and slowing down can be love. In what ways can we expand other energy sources that are not just rage? I think that that's a sort of lifelong exploration, and you become, for me, I become more in my body and more in my power when I can leverage all the other energy sources. And when you're, for me, once you find out a death happens and you're like, and rage is the first thing that's accessible, that gets you somewhere, but it's not the end all and be all. But I do think contrasting them, one as they're all can be rooted in love, right? I love my family, but I can coo them, soften them, cradle them, yell at them, ignore them. I can do all of them, and they're all still tied to love in a particular way. I do think that, you know, one of the things that I really loved that you mentioned, Ken, was around the questions that needed to be asked. And for me, one of the ways that I reorient around, particularly my relationships with folks in community we have a common relationship based on rage, folks that I organize with in different contexts. It can be very, it quickly can just stay, the relationship can just stay to that. You know, if you're talking for 3 hours or you're doing something for 4 hours, there's just not, and it's all about whatever you need to get out there. There's not much time for checking in with each other. You're done and you're expended. So I try to reorient myself now more than ever with folks that I'm spewing rage with, to ask those questions. First time we get together, have you eaten today? How's your mom? Like really force myself to ask those sort of real life sort of questions, and perhaps we can expend energy in other ways beyond rage.
Yes.
I want to make sure that we get a number of these questions out there. Kin, do you mind moving us to the next question?
Yes. And I wanted to thank Rodney for that response. Thank you so much. And for also Kristen for putting that question out there. It was great. This question is about conversations in the global media, which oftentimes looking at Black activism will focus on one particular region, one particular part of the world, when we know indeed that we are resisting and we are evolving and pushing conversations forward all over the globe. So in our dance of revolution, for many of us, especially here in the US, it was the first time that we had been exposed to a long-standing tradition of rebellion in Toronto and Ontario, actually. So what comes to mind when we start thinking about liberation movements around the world? How do we feel about this falsehood of separation that we see being played out in the media? And do we feel that we are able to be more effective in terms of bridging those false connections and bringing an understanding of our past? Because all of us are rooted in the move forward, and yet we each have particular issues that we're impacted by. So in what way, maybe we could start with Phillip. in what way in the film do you feel that you had an opportunity to bridge some of those gaps?
Well, I want to start off by just bringing in some historical perspective. It's sort of alluded to, I think Courtney alluded to it in the film, but there was a time in Toronto in the late 70s and the 80s when if you wanted something Black and queer, you had to go to the States. I mean, literally, you know, we would pack up and rent a van and go to Atlanta Pride or DC Black Pride, or, you know, go to the Black Nations, Queer Nations Conference in New York City. And that's where Black queer stuff was being produced. I mean, it was Essex Hemphill, it was the poets, it was GMAD in New York, right? And as Courtney said, and David said it earlier, there comes a point when, you know, you got to realize if you want something, you got to build it yourself. So we can't keep hopping on planes and going to the States. We can't keep, you know, doing that. We have to build something local. And so I think that it's interesting that, so in a way, we definitely, I mean, we learned from the US experience, right? We learned from, I mean, the IA group in Toronto was somewhat loosely structured on the GMAD folks in New York City, right? So we learned from them. And we learned from the cultural production, the poetry, the books, the recordings, all of that stuff that came out. And so I think there always is that sort of transnational, you know, cross-pollination, right? But of course, you know, the US is this big thing. And so while we were aware of you, y'all were not so much aware of us, right? And so, yeah, so I mean, that's definitely, as I said, a number of folks who alluded to it in the film, but I just want to kind of bring that historical perspective to it, that, yeah, there is that sort of transnational cross-pollination happening.
Exactly. Thank you. And in that cross-pollination, oftentimes there is some confusion about our role as legacy bearers, right? And how it's important for us to pull all of those threads together, at least to be connected to each other so that we can pay homage and learn from what others have learned. And this is a conversation actually that Berette, you had brought up, and you had mentioned JFLAG, for example, and some of the ways in which the community builders in other parts of the world are starting to see their work being reenacted, unbeknownst, unwittingly, not with any malice, and perhaps missing out on some of the deeper underpinnings that are important for them to continue to carry through in that work.
Barrett?
We just
Barrett.
need to mic me, dear.
Ah, there we go.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just to add additional contours to how you shape that, Kin, is, yeah, thinking about there's several striking things about this documentary, Philip, that performs this importance and this anchoring of community, but also all of the communities within these intersectional groups that are practicing various forms of activism, right? So there's the way you figure music in liberation movements. And we know music is such a huge part of any liberation movement anywhere in the world where Black people and queer people are gathering to try and change systemic oppressions, but also how craft arts, how visual arts are also figuring in that, how writers figure in this so strongly, and that there are several communities within each of those practices. So there's an artistic voice that is intersectional, as well as our struggles that are intersectional. And that comes across so clearly and so passionately in this film, but also, you know, thinking about how are we naming that, right? How are we naming the accents or the references that we're pulling from, or how are we able to name that? Because as you say, America is a place that has a very big stage and sort of, I don't want to use the word dominates, even though that's kind of what I mean, but
Come on now, Berette. That's what we talked about.
You know, it kind of, because of what that space is, what that geographical space is. And
Right.
so as a result, we don't know the names of the people who uphold J-Flag in Jamaica, right? Or we might not know who is anybody familiar with the liberation movements in Uganda with Kasha Nabagesera, who has done really powerful work for leading liberation movements in East Africa that has spread beyond in terms of the language, activisms, and strategies of queer communities on the continent. And also just thinking about, because there's so many Jamaicans in this film, I remember watching a few of the scenes where there are the street marches of all of the younger activists, and they're holding these embellished coffins that immediately brings to mind Ebony G. Patterson, who is a very celebrated visual artist from Jamaica who shows her work all over the world and has this series of work where she embellishes small coffins to represent Black children that have not been recognized, have been lost to violence and not been recognized, because our children are not seen as children according to systemic structures. And so when they die, they are not recognized in that way. And she created this work and street marches with these coffins in Trinidad first, and then again in Jamaica. And then I see these coffins also, you know, represented in the march that was shown in Toronto. And just thinking, oh gosh, how are we naming how we're pulling from each other's works into the activisms, or how can we? And this is a question I think I would just put out to everyone. What are the extra strategies or principles that we can use as we're educating more people to name not only those who have come before, but to investigate who is doing now parallel to our actions in our different geographies.
Right. A large part of that is also naming the value of it, right?
Yeah.
Like being very clear that the strategies that we're employing might also be strategies that someone else could use some benefit in the, you know, this collaboration around. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they've been trying it and it hasn't been working, you know?
Yeah.
And so thank you for bringing, Barrett, that truth around how this is the question. Mm-hmm. This is the question. Do you mind if we toss that question to David and Rodney? The question that you just asked about the importance of being able to see these strands, and recognize the ways in which we are building resistance. Do you want to repeat the question, or you're good at the question?
Oh, sorry. Yes, sure. So just thinking about how we are actively naming not only the people that come before us, but how are we creating strategies and principles of naming the people who are doing work parallel to our actions now within different geographies.
You want to speak to that, Rodney, first? No, you go.
No, you go.
No, you go.
So I feel like in the work that, and it's interesting because you started it here too, off camera, Kin, when you began by doing an invocation, right? And I know that that's something that when Sunset Service was in operation, that we made sure to be the way that we started off everything, right? Is to call in the names of those folks that have gone on before, connected to us by blood or best intention, recognizing that, you know, you don't have to have a particular metaphysical understanding of that activity, that ritual. Like, you know, I still, before classes or before meetings, enact invocation of the ancestors. I don't have any kind of spiritual, religious, you know, inclination in that, but I recognize that it's an opportunity to hold into consciousness that it didn't start with you, right? So it's a humbling moment when you call out and you realize that of all the names that you called out, that's only like a fraction of the people who were responsible for you being here, either literally embodied or who have done the sort of groundwork to allow you to be able to hold the space that you do. And so I loved that you started us off that way. I think it's a good way to reorient, to use the word that Rodney brought up earlier, to reorient the relationship that we have to the work that we do, and recognizing that it's like a drop in a bucket, but every drop has its place in this bucket. And I think as it related to Sunset Service, because art was such a big part of, and performance was such a big part of, we were very conscious of how we were drawing from things that came before, you know, and it was fun and empowering. I think back to this thing around how we hold each other, I think it's the process of remembering that you're not the first, can be very liberating, especially when it begins to feel overwhelming, right? Right now I'm engaged in some theater making work, and a lot of what we're doing is telling the stories of racialized queer men. And we start off with a story about, you know, an uncle that I had that sort of died during the height of HIV/AIDS, and whom I didn't get to know. But I recognize that the lives of these people, even those whom I've never been connected to or know, were so instrumental to me being able to be here and be involved in change work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to nod the work that you did just as we got started, and how I think that those little rituals are significant in reorienting, to use Rodney's word.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. And I've learned from all of the people in my circle who have held that practice and have helped me to understand the beauty of the practice. So I just want to pay homage to all of the people who taught me that this is how we remember. And this is how we also recount our own steps and remind ourselves that others are witnessing us and that we have brought something to other people, you know, that we've empowered them to.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sincerely hoping, as we're talking, that there are young activists who are actually young people engaged in revolution who are benefiting, right? And this is being recorded, and so it can be revisited. But I didn't want to Rodney. I was deeply struck by those same coffins that Barrett was talking about, and I wanted to sort of turn back to that, as well as some of the large cutouts of different faces, and it really struck me that, you know, I was watching Nine Nights, watching Carnival. I was watching a different version of a Pride parade than I'd ever seen before. And I've been to Toronto Pride a few times, and it's one of the largest in the world. And here you made a decision to. I mean, you were asked, obviously, it says in the film, to lead the parade, and you made a decision to shut it down. I was so struck by all of those things. Because I didn't realize it even happened, and I pay attention, and I didn't know. So can you tell us a little bit about how that evolved, how the aesthetics of that came about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things specifically to that question, Cooper. I think we recognize very much that we're drawing from a lineage, both past and present, of Black aesthetics, Black activists, Black organizers. And so from the Black, the sort of the Black textured, almost leather, almost evoking of like superheroes meet the Black Panthers, down to visuals that pulled in aesthetics and reference contemporary artists, we wanted it to feel very much like another dimension of something that you have seen before, as you mentioned, that it was very much the Pride Parade, but just in another dimension, in another way. Part of that was also protection and armor for ourselves. I'm not gonna lie to you in front here and be like, heck yeah, I'm ready, was ready to take it on. This was the very first time that our Prime Minister was marching at Pride. And so the very first time that our head of state was marching, I'd never been at Pride and noticed snipers on roofs. I had never, the tension of the day was very much palpable. And so the couching ourselves in Black aesthetics and Black honoring Black artists, organizers, and activists from past and present, literally making ourselves as superheroes with the quilt pen. All of that was also armor, and in a sort of, it's I'm a million people, you get lost, but we were all together in a sort of trance and a ritual all together. It was all for the internal to be able to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. And then for the first bit around, I'm really reflecting on how do we continue to build these sort of trends across border conversations. I think that I'm thinking even about our origin, and that even beyond before we created our group, our interest in this sort of BLM movement came way before even our first action. David, Catherine, some folks in the community organized a bus and a caravan down to Ferguson when Ferguson was happening, and I think externally, other Black folks around other countries had always had an interest in what was going on in the US, and what was going on in terms of resistance and revolutions in the US. And I think that it's very easy from the North American perspective to keep that perspective to each other. And once you go elsewhere and you look out and you realize the Black folks are actually doing the thing everywhere, from Honduras to Brazil to Uganda to UK, to really everywhere.
Yes.
Everywhere I travel and I realize, oh, there's Black folks everywhere. And the legacy of transatlantic slave trade means that we're fighting wherever we are. I think really, it's that challenge is a challenge that we haven't even begun to start cracking. I think that there's some organizers that work with in Minneapolis, and the Black Visions Collective, that I've known for some time. And, they, Candace specifically, had been developing this relationship with Juntos, which is a youth group, an Afro-Brazilian youth group in Brazil. And it's a multi-year relationship. And it makes me think about, how it's difficult. Community relationships are difficult when you're can go right next. You can go hop in an Uber and go see the person and talk to. But these sort of cross-border relationships are so difficult. And I think that they take so much time, and it's about giving that time for that relationship to be developed and recognizing that it's a slow burn. But they are so beneficial. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to folks south of the border. I can't tell you, and no lie, at least 5 times, where I haven't had to articulate that there are Black folks in Canada, but pretty much have had to articulate that there are Black folks in Canada. And so that's still within the sort of privilege of North America. That's still within the context of, it's easy for us with these statuses and these papers to take interest in other countries, because we can just go and visit. We can just go to Brazil. We can just go grab a visa and move. And so it is actually incumbent on us to do most of the labor for ourselves to learn about the realities of people actually doing work in Senegal and all of these places way before us, way before Black Lives Matter was a thing, and way after that. And so I think the work actually, it's us on this side of the West. It's us on these countries that actually have to do most of the work to learn about the very people that are already doing work, whether or not we know them or not, whether or not CNN is talking to them or not, they are doing the work. And queer and trans folks are doing the work everywhere, probably a bit more innovatively, with less resources, more creatively than we are doing.
Yes, speak that. There was a
Rodney, finish me.
Yeah.
Rodney, can I just give some? I can't even contain it. Rodney, just finish me. That was, no, you really said all of the complex layers and the spillages of those layers. The way you just phrased that. And if I can just tag on to it about Brazil. Brazil is also a place, believe it or not, for everyone who's listening out there, has to also say, yes, there are Black people here. And we are talking about the country that has the largest Black population outside of the continent of Africa.
Yes.
And they have to say, there are Black people here. And may I just add, Black people were not always counted on the consensus, even though they make up 57% of the entire Brazilian population.
What?
That's how they are working down there innovatively in that massive country that is as big as North America.
That's right.
across regions and states, being killed by their government and tweeted about. Yes, with less resources. Thank you very much, Rodney.
That's right. Thank you, Berette. Thank you, Berette.
Sorry, I was yelling.
Right.
It was all the excitement, you know, the passion of the rage and all of that.
Rage and love, rage and love.
Tell you, tell you.
This is the value. This is the value, right?
Yes.
That we can't let others, those who would seek to oppress us, to see us devalued, tell us what our value is. We have to see it in each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I love you all so much. This has been the best afternoon, and it's been good.
Yes, sweetness in this conversation. I'm going to ask us one last thing as we part. I'm going to ask us to take a step back because David, you touched on this last conversation. We revolved around it and glanced it again this time. And you have troubled the waters of my mind with the challenge about what is activism and what is it to be an activist, right? And I think it's really important to revisit that question, not just in terms of a building of community, which we also touched on, but what is it that troubles you about, because you didn't name quite that this time, what is it that troubles you? Oh Lord Jesus, let my little tinny's coming out. I'll re-Americanize. It troubles you about the word activist and activism. I'll just leave it there and leave it for you. And if you can all sort of respond to how you feel, how do you take that up? How do you take up this notion of activism? We're going to make it quite brief, but we're going to revolve on it.
Yeah, I think I've always sort of been troubled by the concept of activism. I think I shared the last time that I ended my high school career at an alternative school full of a lot of very conscious folks before it was mainstreamed, and oftentimes, you know, very few racialized people. And there were oftentimes critiques about what was felt to be my lack of engagement in activism. And I think I shared that the instance of a friend sort of making mention that they didn't see me at any of the events or the rallies that a lot of the folks that I went to school with were attending. And I shared during that time that it was actually a very hard time. High school, that whole period was a very difficult transition time for me. And that for me, I felt like every time that I left my house and I didn't get killed or kill myself or kill somebody else was me being engaged in my activism work. And over the last now almost 2 decades, I've seen how that kind of idea of what it means to be an activist has become the norm and has been taken up and has become quite popular. Mm-hmm. And everybody and their cousin's an activist. Mm-hmm. Everybody and their cousin wears it like a badge. And back to what I think I made mention of before, like if you understand any work that you're engaged in as change work and relationship work, then it decenters you in it. And I know that there have been times in my life and in my career where I have completely centered myself. And by reorienting it to like relationships, and it shifts it. So activism, I think, for me, just connote it's my bad high school experiences with a whole lot of white kids with dreads and opinions, and it shifted the way that I saw that. And I know that's my bias. I know that's my thing. So I just, you know.
No, it is incredibly, I mean, as somebody who lives in Seattle, let me tell you, I used to have locks down to my waist and below. And it was very difficult to find somebody who could do locks. But let me give you a small example. One, I didn't have dreads. I had locks. Right? It was like, it was a New York version of some, and I'm bringing it up because I'm saying I could go to 5 shops and find locticians who could do white people's hair. And there were 2 at the time, one good and one meh. at the time when I first arrived here who could do locks on African hair. And I had just come from New York. I was disgusted because this is a very liberal space. And for white people to walk around with locks is fine. I mean, I have, do you? But for me, do you, right? But it was very telling to me, exactly in the way that I'm reflecting on what you're saying. It was very telling to me that there was a kind of righteousness that came with that, that hopefully a good number of people, as they're maturing and understanding how they are going to embrace a revolutionary positionality, that they are going to question for themselves, what is it that I'm doing when I'm engaging in this activism? And how is it and how dare I address somebody else on how they do theirs? Because my everyday, as you were saying, is an act of living, right? An act of living to me is an activism, because I walk in the street and that's me. And as somebody who's genderqueer, I appear one way, I look another way, I act another way, I sound another way, and I challenge people's sense of being in the world. And okay, but just by walking around. So I really took it to heart when you first brought this up. It was like, yes, this I can learn from a new generation. I'm so excited. Please move on with same question to all of you.
I'm pausing to see if anyone's going. Philip?
Philip, let's.
I just, another, remembrance from the 90s. So, in 1993, I sort of stepped out into community, joined the board at Black Cap. And about late 90s, about 1997, someone was organizing a photo tribute at the 519, which is the community center in the queer community here, or what was then the village, sort of the central queer community. And so this was about putting up photographs of Black activists in this community center. And the person approached me for an 8x10 of myself so I could put there. And I was like, I really had to think about it. Because I never really thought of myself as an activist, right? And so I felt a way about having my photograph there. And I remember talking to my partner at the time about it. And he said, Philip, well, what is an activist but someone who acts, right? Someone who just doesn't observe the world sort of passively, but someone who acts in any way, in the largest sense of the word, right? And it really made me begin to think about it. And so, I think about my mother, for example, who was a public health nurse, who was one of the kindest, most giving persons I know. I mean, number of relatives who stayed in our house in Kingston from the country. And she would do stuff for people. And to me, my mother was an activist. I don't think she would ever think of herself as an activist. She was never going to stand in City Hall with a bullhorn, and shout. But she was an activist, right? And so I take it in its largest sense. It's what my partner said. It's people who act. Simple as that, right? There are those who see and pass by, walk by, and do nothing for whatever reasons, not being judgmental. And then there are those who, for whatever reasons, feel motivated to act in whatever way, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. My 2 cents.
Thank you. Barrett, you have a little something to add?
I have a little something. I'm thinking about this quote, and I hope I'm getting the right person who said it in the film, Angela Robertson, who said, for us, the act of making ourselves visible is political, right? And I'm thinking about that and sort of adding on to it, the words of Audre Lorde, that, the self-care is an act, or self-preservation is an act of activism, or, just thinking about the days when I decide not to keep the rage up and to pull back and step into my garden, it feels like activism. It feels like a protest, which also feels so hackneyed and weird to even call that a protest, because the language protest and activism, all these words have become so loaded with and so commodified and so, you know, used as business plans now to like build out new companies and things. I feel like banks are using this language now. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So I think there's this thing that I've said a lot in you know, in company among my friends and family that I'll say here and I'll probably keep saying. And this, I started saying this around the time when we were using the term woke, you know, stay woke, which has also become its own loaded thing. I kept asking people, well, what does woke mean, or what does stay woke mean if that is the charge or the foundation underneath which you're gonna, you know, gallop towards justice? And if that becomes the thing in and of itself, it can't last. It's empty and it's temporary almost. And also speaking to the self-care discourses we've been having, it will burn out. And for me, how I return back, or how I try to return back to a calmer, more loving way, a more inclusive and generative way of activism, is to think, if we were to solve all these problems, like if all of the problems were solved next week, Tuesday, what do you have planned on Wednesday morning? I work with that. You feel me? I love the clap, David. Thank you. Right? Because I have to visualize a self and a reality past this fight. Otherwise, what am I fighting for? And your identity becomes the fight. And that's not an identity. That's not a life. We're trying to get past that so we can live in joy and live nice with each other, you know? So that's my 2 cents.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes, this bliss birthright. This bliss birthright. That right there. This compassion birthright. I extend compassion to myself above and beyond first. And that right there is not what is expected of me. And I don't care, because that's my birthright. And I love bliss. I'm into, if there's any kind of activism, it would be bliss activism. I'd like to find all of the various ways that we can continue to enjoy this experience. You know, this one, the one that we determine. So that was Wednesday, we're all going to get together. Berette, I have hot tubbing. I have I have a whole plethora of things. And the only caveat is you have to come to Oakland to do it. You have to come down here and come see me, girl. I love this. I want everyone to know how much.
Do you want to add to the last bit of it?
I mean, I would agree with everyone saying. David, we've had this conversation many times, and I think it's always interesting, and it was great to hear you articulate it. And I think for me, I think the activist is just such. It's like the iceberg, you know. It's the one that it is that tip of the iceberg, and we see the activists, we see the lead activists, we see the ones who's the name, and yet the rest of the iceberg is what allows the change to happen. And so I don't know if we need a rush to have more activists, but we definitely need more healers. We definitely need more documentation. We need more communicators. We need more strategic thinkers. We need more, you know, when we think about the action that you brought up, Cooper, like the activism of it was actually the simplest part, communicating that and developing the communicators, the folks who do all the other pieces of the scaffolding to hold the messaging together, those who are documenting all of the work in our communities, even beyond, those are all part of the work. And so for me, healing and being, as you mentioned, Kin, and our bliss activism, or birthright of bliss birthright, I think is something that yeah, I'm in agreement with everyone saying.
May I share something really quickly? This just popped
Please.
into my head.
Yes.
There's an incredible young being who plays drums every Saturday morning at the lake and became part of a nationwide, and I think even an international story, because someone traipsed by, and he had been doing this for a year, and said, you know, I don't like you playing music here. You must move. His response was to develop a new rhythm, you know, just to keep it going. And the way that we are clear about our bliss, I think about him. When I go by on Saturdays to be able to wave and he just gets a new rhythm going, that is the bliss birthright that I'm talking about. This is our music. We get to dance to it.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for everyone being here and adding your music and your love and your joy. Coop.
Yes.
Phillip, he set this in motion.
Yes. Thank you guys so much for sharing space, holding community with each other and with me. I am nothing but honored and privileged, and I really look forward to the next things, to hearing from all of you, to staying in touch with you, and being able to be in community with you again. Thank you so much, Kin, for co-hosting and balancing this out, this lovely dance that we have. Yes, this is what do you call it? The birthright of bliss. The bliss birthright. I am gonna hold on to that. Y'all are healing my heart.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right?
Big thank you. Big thanks, as we say in Jamaica. Big up Coop, and big up Kin for really championing the film and bringing it to, you know, an audience and facilitating this discussion, which has been wonderful. So big up to all of you, and for participating. Rodney, thanks so much. David and Berette, pleasure to meet you. Good stuff, people. Good stuff.
Okay. Thanks again to Seattle Queer Film Festival. Happy 25th anniversary, Seattle Queer Film Festival. What?
Happy anniversary.
Yes, man. All right. Love you all. Peace and blessings. Be well.
Thank you. Let's stay connected. Peace.
Bye.
Coop, before we go, Coop, can we take a
break? Oh.
Uh-oh. They don't shut it up.
No.
I did a screenshot I can send to us all.
Did you? Okay, wait. No, lean in.
Come on now.
All right, I'm going to tell you when it's ready.
We're still live, y'all.
Put on your hot plate now. Ready?
Yes. Beautiful.
Got it.
Hey.